Well, it's shaping up to be a really big week for the country because this week, the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments on whether the 14th Amendment disqualifies Donald Trump from the ballot. And today, just a few hours ago, actually, we got a pretty good window into how Trump's legal team plans to make their arguments. And let me tell you, this brief, I read it today, includes a fair number of arguments from an alternate universe. For starters, Trump's lawyers claim the former president is not, in fact, an officer of the United States, which is who the 14th Amendment covers. Now, this is not a new or surprising argument necessarily being made by the Trump team, but let's be real. It kind of defies logic. I mean, how could it be that the president of the United States is not an officer of the United States, with an obligation, by the way, to abide by the Constitution? Wasn't that kind of what the founders had in mind? But then there's the other, perhaps even more startling piece, at least to me, of revisionist history that is included in this brief, that Donald Trump did not engage in an insurrection. In fact, according to the argument here, it was not an insurrection at all. The brief actually includes these claims. 1, there was no insurrection. 2, Trump did not incite anything, and President Trump did not engage in anything that constitutes insurrection. It even goes so far as to explain why the events of that day were not an insurrection at all, including that it lasted only about 3 hours. What a weird argument that is. And few, if any, carried firearms. Okay, let's pause on that. Because by that logic that they just outlined there, I guess if a robbery or murder doesn't take a lot of time, only 3 hours, let's say, and not that many people are carrying firearms, then it's not a crime? So this brief filed today, in black and white, really is also a reminder of how Trump and his team view the attack on our Capitol and our democracy. That's what it reminded me of. But if you put those mind-bending arguments aside for a moment, though we will certainly dig into them, I promise, with our first guest, what Trump's case really boils down to, as they lay out, actually on the very first page of this brief right here, is basically that voters should be able to decide. They say the people should choose our next president, not the courts, not elected officials, but voters. And of course, that's true. We all believe that. But it's awfully rich coming from the people who wrote this brief. I mean, remember, the reason we are here right now is because Trump did not want to let the voters decide. Trump and his supporters launched a coordinated pressure campaign at the local, state, and federal level, we all remember, to overturn what the voters had decided. They created slates of fake electors, attempted to compromise and overtake the Department of Justice, and stood back as a mob descended on the U.S. Capitol, all to undo the will of voters. And remember, the voters did decide on Joe Biden. So despite the arguments in this brief, when they had the chance to let the voters decide, they did the exact opposite. And they are already saying, if given the chance, they will do it again.
Would you have certified the election results had you been vice president?
If I had been vice president, I would have told the states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and so many others that we needed to have multiple slates of electors, and I think the U.S. Congress should have fought over it from there.
Will you vote to certify the results of the 2024 election, no matter what they show?
Well, I voted not to certify the state of Pennsylvania.
What about 2024?
We will see if this is a legal and valid election.
So, even as Trump's team is arguing we should let the voters decide, his top defenders, his potential picks for vice president, which I'm sure both of them are thinking, are on television saying that they have no intention of doing so. They are expressing undemocratic views at the same time that Trump's own lawyers are trying to claim the high ground. They're insisting in this brief file today that kicking him off the ballot would be undemocratic. But civil rights lawyer Sherrilyn Ifill says it's actually the opposite. In a brief she submitted to the Supreme Court ahead of Thursday's argument, she writes, quote, failure to apply the constitutional prerequisite for the office of President Trump would constitute an undemocratic exercise of power. Applying the law equally to everyone, regardless of station and despite popular opposition, is the very essence of the rule of law, a fundamental pillar of democracy. To allow an individual who does not meet the constitutional prerequisites to run for office would send the message that a candidate's popularity or the prominence of the office she seeks determines whether the law will be applied. Could not have said it better. Definitely not. And joining me now is Sherrilyn Ifill. She is the former president and director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's now the Vernon Jordan Distinguished Professor in Civil Rights at Howard Law School. So, Sherrilyn, I am not a lawyer, as you know. We've talked before many times, but I did read your brief today, and it makes a really interesting point you and I have talked about a few times before that is often missed about the origin of the 14th Amendment, that it was meant in part to protect the voices and votes of African-American voters. And many years later, what Trump was trying to do was suppress those voices and votes. You make this point very clearly, which I think is so important in that brief. What did you make of the filing that the brief the Trump team filed today?
I made of it what you made of it, Jen, and thanks for having me on. These were regurgitated talking points and not particularly persuasive or well presented. I think this is the only recourse, however, that Trump's lawyers have is to say things that we know with our naked eye can't possibly be true, like the insurrection wasn't an insurrection. The reality is that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is incredibly clear. The text of it is incredibly clear. The idea that the president is not an officer of the United States is ridiculous. The idea that the framers would have meant to exclude the president from Section 3 is ridiculous. That means that the framers of the 14th Amendment, who were so deeply concerned about the insurrectionist spirit that still existed in the South, and enacted Section 3 to ensure that those who had been defeated in the field, they said, would not be able to continue their rebellion in office, would have been perfectly fine with Jefferson Davis running for president after the Civil War. It's preposterous. And I think it's really important, it's the reason I wrote the brief, to make sure that we surface the concerns that the framers of the 14th Amendment had about the rights of Black people to be full citizens, which is really the core of the 14th Amendment, to ensure full citizenship for Black people, and that Trump's insurrection was a very particular kind of insurrection. It was powered by his attacks on Black voters, his attempt to discredit the votes cast by Black voters, or at least who he thought were predominantly likely to be Black voters in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in Atlanta. Those are not random places that he picked. He picked those places for a very particular reason.
That's very, very clear and such an important point that you raised in this brief. One of the other arguments I did want to raise with you is that people make, even people who are opponents of Trump, is that kicking him off the ballot would spark violence, would empower his people and help him politically. You seem to make the argument, or this is how I read it in the quote I just read, that we can't pay attention to the impacts. We can't predict the impacts because applying the rule of law is so important here. Why is it so important for people to understand that?
That's just simply not a consideration that should be driving the Supreme Court, any more than the Supreme Court in 1954 should have decided that not to decide the Brown case the way they did because they were concerned that white Southerners would not accept it. That's actually not how the Constitution works. You apply the Constitution, you apply the law to the facts, and the court has to say what the law is. Now, how that plays out in real life, that is the job of other branches of government, and the job of local government and the job of individuals. But once we have a Supreme Court that is fearful of the public, then we no longer have a rule of law. We actually have mob rule that is dressed up as though it is refined and being argued in the exalted halls of the Supreme Court. But if we're holding the court hostage to the likelihood of violence, we're in deeper trouble than I think many of us imagined. And of course, it's worth pointing out again, Jen, that we've tried this already. The voters actually voted in 2020. A majority of voters decided that they didn't want Trump, and he refused to accept it. And he and his followers fomented an insurrection to try and overturn it. So the idea that voters should just vote again, leave it to the democratic process, we did that. We tried that. And what we got for it was a very near miss. With violence, with dead police officers, with injured police officers, and with an attack on our republic, with members of Congress running for their lives. So we've already seen that play, and we now know what the danger is. And as the framers of the 14th Amendment say, to not be able to protect yourself, protect your own government against insurrectionists would be madness and folly. and it would be no less madness and folly in 2024 than it would have been in 1868.
There was a point in time, not that long ago, when it was a basic principle of the Republican Party to consider Vladimir Putin a major threat to the United States. I mean, I remember so clearly watching my former boss, Barack Obama, debate Mitt Romney back in 2012, and Romney saying basically exactly that.
Russia, I indicated, is a geopolitical foe. I'm not going to wear rose-colored glasses when it comes to Russia or Mr. Putin.
Now, I'm sure I personally attacked Mitt Romney at the time. I probably did. And I don't typically side with him over Barack Obama. But, I mean, it sure feels like he had a point there. Putin's regime was a threat to our interests. And that threat has actually only grown worse since Romney made those comments in 2012. Remember, back in 2014, Putin invaded Ukraine and seized the Crimean Peninsula. And at that time, the Republican line was to hammer President Obama for not doing enough, in their view, to deter and punish Putin. At the time, Republican Congressman Mike Turner said, quote, "This is a president that is retracting the U.S. policy at a time when obviously Russia sees an opportunity." Senator Lindsey Graham urged President Obama to, quote, "suspend Russian membership in the G8 and the G20 at least for a year and for every day they stay in Crimea. Add to the suspension." And Senator Ted Cruz said that Putin, quote, "has nothing to fear from the United States, and that is why he's proceeding with impunity." That rhetoric was all pretty tough on Russia, and for good reason. They invaded a sovereign country and stole their land. But beginning in 2016, that hardline Republican position toward Russia began to kind of soften. There was, of course, the Donald Trump of it all. That was a big factor. The Republican presidential candidate obviously had a very different view of Vladimir Putin than many in his party. We all know that. History tells us that. You may remember that the Trump campaign actually changed the Republican Party platform on Ukraine's defense in 2016. It went from calling on the U.S. to provide Ukraine lethal defensive weapons, similar to what a lot of those members had called for, to the very much more benign phrase, appropriate assistance. And once Trump took office, he continued to openly praise and defend Vladimir Putin. There was a whole laundry list of things he said, a habit he hasn't exactly been able to break. But during Trump's tenure, there was another very loud and influential right-wing voice that sided with Putin over and over and over again.
Why do I care what's going on in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia? And I'm serious. Like, why do I care? Tell you why. And why shouldn't I root for Russia, which I am?
Could any of these people actually tell you why Vladimir Putin is so bad? Why is he so bad? He's bad! I think we should probably take the side of Russia if we have to choose between Russia and Ukraine. That is my view.
It might be worth asking yourself, since it is getting pretty serious, what is this really about? Why do I hate Putin so much? Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? So why does permanent Washington hate him so much? If you've been watching the news, you know that Putin is having a border dispute with a nation called Ukraine.
Border dispute is certainly one way to characterize a major military invasion. Of course, Carlson is now just another far-right conspiracy peddler with a show on the internet. He's no longer on Fox, as we all know. And he's apparently been spending the last few days in Moscow for some reason. Who knows? We don't know why. He has to stay relevant somehow, so I guess we'll learn in the coming days. Maybe. But his position on Putin and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one that would have been antithetical to Republican orthodoxy less than a decade ago, has apparently become now the majority view within the party. Because Republicans in Congress have been delaying additional aid to Ukraine since October. Today, House Republican leadership rejected any possibility of voting for the Senate's bipartisan compromise bill that would have provided funding for Ukraine, Israel, and the U.S. border. A package that, by the way, as a reminder, they themselves had demanded. And as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said back in December, a vote against funding for Ukraine is a vote to help Putin.
Are you saying that any member of Congress who votes against aid to Ukraine is voting for Putin?
I believe that any member of Congress who does not support funding for Ukraine is voting for an outcome that will make it easier for Putin to prevail. That is, a vote against supporting Ukraine is a vote to improve Putin's strategic position. That's just an inescapable reality.
That's just an inescapable reality. And unfortunately, it's the reality we're currently living in.